The sound of shattering glass pierced the night air, and Margaret knew she had mere seconds to decide. Her husband's heavy footsteps thundered up the stairs, each one a hammer blow of approaching violence. She pressed herself against the bedroom wall, her heart racing so fast she thought it might explode from her chest. This wasn't the first time Thomas had come home drunk and angry, but something in his eyes tonight told her it would be the last time she'd survive if she stayed. 3 years ago, Margaret had answered an advertisement in the Boston Herald. A successful businessman in Wyoming sought a refined wife to manage his household. The letters had been charming, filled with promises of a comfortable life and mutual respect. Thomas had written about his ranch, his prospects, his desire for partnership rather than servitude. She had believed every word, desperate to escape her father's cramped boarding house and the suffocating prospects of spinsterhood at 24. The reality had revealed itself within hours of her arrival. Thomas wasn't a successful businessman. He was a failing rancher with a drinking problem and debts that multiplied like weeds. The comfortable home was a drafty cabin with holes in the roof. The mutual respect was his fist meeting her face whenever his frustrations overflowed. Margaret had learned quickly to move quietly, speak softly, and disappear when the whiskey bottle emerged. But tonight was different. Tonight, Thomas had lost the last of their savings in a card game. Tonight, he'd told her she'd have to earn it back by working at the saloon, doing whatever the men wanted. When she'd refused, he'd grabbed the kitchen knife. Margaret's hands trembled as she stuffed a few belongings into a canvas bag. 2 dresses, her mother's silver locket, the small amount of money she'd hidden in her sewing kit. The door handle began to rattle. Thomas was cursing, slamming his shoulder against the wood. The lock wouldn't hold much longer. She turned to the window. The drop was 15 feet to the ground below. The alternative was waiting behind a door that was already splintering. Margaret threw her bag out first, then climbed onto the sill. The wood cracked loudly as Thomas threw his full weight against the door. She didn't think. She jumped. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs. Pain shot through her ankle, but adrenaline pushed her to her feet. She grabbed her bag and ran toward the tree line, not daring to look back even when she heard Thomas roaring her name from the window above. The forest swallowed her whole, branches scratching her face and arms as she crashed through the underbrush. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs refused to carry her further. Collapsing against a massive pine tree, Margaret finally allowed herself to sob. She was alone in the wilderness with nothing but the clothes on her back and a handful of coins. She had no plan, no destination, no idea which direction led to safety. The temperature was dropping rapidly as night deepened. Wolves howled in the distance, their calls sending chills down her spine. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm her, Margaret felt something else rising in her chest. Freedom. For the first time in 3 years, no one was telling her what to do, where to go, how to speak. The price might be her life, but at least it would be her choice. She pulled her shawl tighter and forced herself to stand. The moon was rising, casting silver light through the trees. If she could just make it through the night, she'd figure out the rest come morning. Margaret chose a direction and started walking, unaware that her desperate flight was leading her toward a fate she could never have imagined. In the darkness ahead, a Lakota hunting party was making camp, and among them was a chief whose life was about to change as dramatically as her own. Dawn broke with cruel beauty, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that mocked Margaret's suffering. She'd walked through the entire night, driven by the terror that Thomas might somehow track her through the forest. Her ankle throbbed with each step, swollen to twice its normal size. Thirst burned her throat like fire. The small creek she'd been following for the past hour seemed like salvation itself. Margaret stumbled down the embankment and fell to her knees in the shallow water. She cupped her hands and drank desperately, not caring that her dress soaked through. The cold water shocked her system but cleared her mind. She needed to think rationally. She was somewhere in the Wyoming wilderness, at least 10 miles from the nearest town based on her night's journey. Going back wasn't an option. Forward was her only choice. As she lifted her head, Margaret's blood turned to ice. 6 men on horseback stood on the opposite bank, watching her in complete silence. They were Lakota warriors, their faces painted for hunting, their eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. She'd heard the stories, the warnings that white settlers whispered about the native tribes. Terror flooded through her veins. One of the men dismounted with fluid grace. He was tall, powerfully built, with long black hair braided with eagle feathers. His face was striking, with high cheekbones and eyes that seemed to see straight through her. Unlike the others, he wore no war paint. A necklace of bear claws rested against his chest, and something in his bearing spoke of authority. This was clearly a man accustomed to command. Margaret tried to stand but her injured ankle gave out. She fell back into the water, gasping at the pain. The man spoke something in Lakota, his voice deep and calm. She shook her head frantically, unable to understand. He tried again in broken English, surprising her completely. You hurt. You run from what? The simple question, delivered without threat, opened a floodgate inside her. Margaret started crying, unable to stop herself. 3 years of fear and abuse, 1 night of desperate flight, and the overwhelming exhaustion all crashed down at once. She tried to answer but only sobs came out. The man turned to his companions and spoke quickly in Lakota. Margaret caught enough of the tone to understand they were debating what to do with her. Some voices sounded harsh, dismissive. But the tall man's voice carried weight, and gradually the discussion ended. He turned back to Margaret and offered his hand. I am Mitawashti. It means good bear. You come. We help. Every warning she'd ever heard screamed at her to refuse. But what choice did she have? Die alone in the wilderness or accept help from people she'd been taught to fear? Margaret looked into Mitawashti's eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in years. Kindness. She took his hand. He lifted her as though she weighed nothing, placing her gently on his horse before mounting behind her. His arms circled her waist to hold her steady, the gesture protective rather than threatening. As they rode, Margaret's fear began to shift. The warriors around them talked and even laughed occasionally, their manner relaxed now that their leader had made his decision. They rode for 2 hours before reaching the Lakota camp. Margaret's first impression was of organized chaos. Women worked at various tasks, children played near the lodges, elderly men sat in circles sharing pipes and stories. Dogs barked at their arrival, and curious faces turned to stare at the white woman riding with their chief. Mitawashti brought her to a large lodge decorated with painted scenes of buffalo hunts. An elderly woman emerged, her face a map of wrinkles that spoke of wisdom and hardship. She looked at Margaret, then at Mitawashti, and spoke sharply in Lakota. He responded patiently, gesturing to Margaret's swollen ankle. The old woman's expression softened slightly. She beckoned Margaret inside. The interior was warm and surprisingly spacious. Buffalo robes covered the floor, and a fire pit in the center filled the space with comfortable heat. The old woman pointed to a bed of furs and indicated Margaret should sit. She began examining the injured ankle with surprisingly gentle hands, clicking her tongue at what she found. From a leather pouch, she produced various herbs and began mixing a poultice. Mitawashti knelt beside them, translating haltingly. The old woman was Wihakwin, his grandmother. She would care for Margaret's injuries. He asked again what she was running from. This time, Margaret found her voice. She told him everything, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. The false promises, the violence, the final threat that had sent her fleeing into the night. Something flickered in Mitawashti's eyes as she spoke. Anger, but not directed at her. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke words that would change everything. You safe here. No man hurt woman in my camp. You stay, heal. Then you choose what you do. The first week passed in a blur of pain and healing. Margaret's ankle required complete rest, forcing her to remain in Wihakwin's lodge while the camp's daily life continued around her. The old woman proved to be a stern but effective caretaker, applying her herbal remedies with practiced efficiency and communicating through gestures and the few English words she knew. Margaret learned quickly that pointing at the water skin meant she was thirsty, that pressing her palms together near her cheek meant she was tired, and that Wihakwin's rare smile meant approval. Mitawashti visited daily, often bringing food or small comforts. His English improved noticeably with each conversation, and Margaret realized he was studying her language with the same intensity he likely brought to everything. He told her about his people, the Oglala Lakota, and their struggles against the encroaching white settlers who broke treaties as easily as breathing. His father had been chief before him, killed defending their hunting grounds. Now the responsibility fell on Mitawashti's shoulders to keep his people safe in an increasingly hostile world. Margaret shared her own story more fully. Her mother had died when she was 12, leaving her to manage her father's boarding house in Boston. When he remarried a woman who made it clear Margaret wasn't welcome, the mail-order bride advertisement had seemed like destiny. She'd dreamed of adventure, of building something meaningful. Instead, she'd found herself trapped in a nightmare. You have courage, Mitawashti said one evening as they sat by the fire. Many would not jump from window. Many would not survive forest alone. Margaret laughed bitterly. I had no choice. Staying meant death. At least running gave me a chance. That is wisdom, he replied. To know when to fight and when to run. Both take strength. As her ankle healed, Margaret began venturing outside. The camp's inhabitants had moved from suspicion to curiosity. The children were boldest, approaching to touch her red hair with wonder, giggling when she smiled at them. The women were more reserved, but Margaret noticed them watching as she struggled with basic tasks. When she tried to carry water and nearly fell, a young woman named Takawin stepped forward to help, showing her the proper way to balance the heavy skin. Margaret threw herself into learning their ways. She observed how the women tanned hides, prepared food, and crafted beautiful beadwork. Her sewing skills from Boston translated surprisingly well, and soon she was helping repair tears in clothing and lodge coverings. The work felt honest in a way her life with Thomas never had. Here, every task had purpose, and completion brought genuine satisfaction rather than just the absence of punishment. But the cultural divide remained vast. Margaret struggled with the Lakota language, her tongue unable to form the unfamiliar sounds properly. The spiritual practices confused her, though she found the reverence for nature beautiful. The communal lifestyle challenged everything she'd known about privacy and personal property. Most difficult was accepting the kindness offered by people she'd been taught to fear and hate. Mutawashti seemed to sense her internal conflict. One afternoon, he took her to a high ridge overlooking the valley where his people had camped for generations. The view was breathtaking, rolling grasslands stretching to distant mountains that pierced the sky like teeth. "Your people say this land is yours to take," he said quietly. "My people say this land is ours to protect. Both believe they are right. Both believe Great Spirit is on their side." He turned to look at her directly. "What do you believe?" Margaret had no answer. Everything she'd been taught said the natives were savages, that civilization and Christianity needed to be brought to them by force if necessary. But these past weeks had shown her people with rich traditions, complex societies, and values that often put white settlers to shame. Mutawashti treated his people with respect, listened to elders, and considered all voices before making decisions. Thomas had ruled through fear and violence, caring only for his own desires. "I don't know what I believe anymore," she admitted. "Everything I thought I knew has been challenged." "That is good," Mutawashti said, surprising her. "Only fools are certain of everything. Wisdom comes from questions." As spring advanced into early summer, Margaret found herself settling into a rhythm she'd never anticipated. She woke with the sun, helped prepare the morning meal, spent days working alongside the women, and ended evenings sharing stories around the fire. Her hands grew calloused from work, her skin bronzed from constant sun exposure, her body stronger from physical labor and proper food. She barely recognized the pale, frightened woman who'd fled Thomas's cabin. But she also couldn't ignore the growing complication in her heart. Mutawashti had become more than her rescuer or the chief who'd offered sanctuary. Their daily conversations had evolved into something deeper, a connection that transcended language and culture. She found herself watching for his return from hunting trips, her heart lifting when she spotted his tall figure on the horizon. The way he smiled at her when he thought no one was looking made her stomach flutter in a way she'd never experienced. It terrified her. Falling in love with a Lakota chief was impossible, impractical, and potentially dangerous for them both. His people were counting on him to lead them through increasingly difficult times. She was still legally married to Thomas, though she'd never go back. The gulf between their worlds seemed impossible to bridge. Yet when Mutawashti looked at her, Margaret saw a future she'd never dared imagine. Summer arrived with a vengeance, bringing heat that shimmered across the plains and forced the tribe to adjust their daily rhythms. Work happened in early morning and late evening, while the brutal midday hours were spent resting in the shade. Margaret had been with the Lakota for 3 months now, and the transformation was complete. Her hair had grown longer, often braided in the style of the other women. Her skin was deeply tanned, her body lean and strong. She spoke Lakota haltingly but adequately, mixing in English words when vocabulary failed her. The biggest change, however, was internal. Margaret had stopped thinking of herself as a temporary guest waiting to return to white civilization. The question of where she belonged had quietly answered itself. She belonged here, among people who valued strength of character over social standing, where a woman's worth wasn't measured by her submission but by her contributions. Wehakwen had noticed the change too. One evening, as they worked together preparing pemmican, the old woman spoke without looking up from her task. "You love my grandson." It wasn't a question, which made denying it pointless. Margaret's hands stilled. "Is it that obvious?" To anyone with eyes, Wehakwen replied, mixing Lakota and English as they often did now. "He loves you too. This is problem, yes? How can it not be? I'm white. His people have every reason to hate mine. I would bring him nothing but complications. Wehacwen made a dismissive sound. You bring him happiness. You bring him someone who sees not chief, but man. This is rare gift. She finally looked up, her dark eyes piercing. You think you're not good enough? You survive bad man, survive forest, survive joining strange people. You work hard, learn fast, respect our ways. You are already Lakota in heart. Rest is just ceremony. The word struck Margaret like lightning. She'd been so focused on the obstacles that she hadn't considered the possibility that acceptance could be this simple. That love could be enough to bridge the divide she'd thought insurmountable. That night, the tribe gathered for a celebration. A successful buffalo hunt meant full bellies and an excuse for music and dancing. Margaret sat with the other women, watching the firelight play across the dancers' faces. Mutawashti emerged from his lodge dressed in ceremonial clothing, his chest bare except for intricate paint designs, his movements powerful as he joined the dance. Their eyes met across the fire. The moment stretched, loaded with unspoken words and suppressed feelings. Then Mutawashti did something unprecedented. He crossed to where Margaret sat and extended his hand to her, inviting her to dance with him in front of the entire tribe. The gesture's meaning was unmistakable. This wasn't just a dance. It was a declaration. Margaret's heart hammered as she took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. She didn't know the steps, but he guided her patiently, his hands on her waist, moving her in rhythm with the drums. The tribe watched in electric silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the pounding heartbeat of the drums. I need to speak with you, Mutawashti said quietly, his English formal with emotion. Alone. Margaret nodded, unable to trust her voice. They slipped away from the celebration, walking to the edge of camp where the grassland stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars so thick it looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. In my world, Mutawashti began, man who wants woman must prove his worth. He must bring gifts to her family, demonstrate he can provide and protect. Your family is far away. Your husband is enemy. So I speak to you directly. He took her hands in his, the gesture achingly tender. I have led my people for 5 winters. I have made many hard choices, sacrificed much for their safety. But with you, I am not chief. I am just man who has found his other half. Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks. I'm still married in the eyes of the law. I have nothing to offer you but trouble and complications. Your people need a leader who isn't distracted by a white woman who brings memories of everything they've suffered. My people need a leader who understands that strength comes in many forms, he countered. They need to see that our old ways of judging worth by skin color or tribe are not the only path forward. You have shown many in this camp that not all white people are enemies. Your presence has opened minds. And if Thomas comes looking for me? If the army decides I'm being held captive and uses it as an excuse to attack? Then we face those threats as we face all threats, together. Mutawashti cupped her face gently, his thumb wiping away her tears. I am not fool. I know loving you is complicated. But complication does not make love less true. I have watched you transform from frightened woman to warrior. I have seen your kindness with children, your patience with elders, your determination to learn and grow. I have fallen in love with who you are, not despite your differences but including them. Margaret couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. Everything she dreamed of in those lonely nights with Thomas, every fantasy of what real love might feel like, paled compared to this moment. Mutawashti loved her not for what she could provide or how well she obeyed, but for who she was at her core. I love you, she whispered. I've been terrified to admit it, even to myself. But I love you with everything I am. His kiss was soft at first, questioning, giving her space to pull away. When she instead pressed closer, it deepened into something passionate and claiming. They held each other under the stars, 2 people from different worlds who'd found in each other exactly what they'd been searching for. When they finally returned to camp, hand in hand, Wehacwen was waiting outside her lodge. She looked at them, nodded once with satisfaction, and disappeared inside. The message was clear. The grandmother had given her blessing. Now came the harder part, convincing the rest of the tribe that their chief's choice would strengthen rather than weaken them. The announcement of Mutawashti's intention to take Margaret as his wife created exactly the controversy they'd anticipated. The tribal council met for 3 days straight, voices rising and falling in heated debate. Some argued that a white woman could never truly become Lakota, that the marriage would be seen as betrayal by those who'd lost family to settler violence. Others pointed to Margaret's proven character and the happiness their chief deserved after years of self-sacrifice. The discussions were passionate but civil, reflecting the democratic traditions that had sustained the tribe for generations. On the fourth day, a rider arrived with news that shifted everything. Thomas had been found dead outside a saloon, killed in a drunken brawl over cards. The information came from a sympathetic trader who thought Margaret should know. She felt no grief, only a profound relief that he could never hurt her again. More importantly, from a legal standpoint, she was now a widow, free to marry without the complication of a living husband. The council took this as a sign. The spirits had cleared the path forward. After one more day of deliberation, they granted their approval with conditions. Margaret must undergo a formal adoption ceremony into the tribe, taking a Lakota name and publicly committing to their ways. She would need to demonstrate continued respect for their traditions and work to bridge understanding between their people and peaceful white settlers. Most significantly, any children from the union would be raised Lakota first, learning the language and customs from birth. Margaret agreed to everything without hesitation. The adoption ceremony took place under a full moon, witnessed by the entire tribe. Wehahquin led the ritual, speaking ancient words while painting Margaret's face with sacred symbols. The old woman presented her with a dress of soft deerskin decorated with intricate beadwork, a gift that had taken weeks to complete in secret. When she announced Margaret's new name, Wikapi Waist, Good Star Woman, for the hope she'd brought to their chief's heart, the tribe erupted in ululating cries of acceptance. The wedding followed 3 days later, blending Lakota customs with a few elements important to Margaret's upbringing. Mutawashti presented gifts to Wehahquin as Margaret's adopted family, demonstrating his ability to provide. They exchanged vows in both English and Lakota, promising to honor each other as equals and face whatever challenges came together. The celebration lasted until dawn, filled with feasting, dancing, and stories that wove Margaret permanently into the tribe's narrative. Their first night together as husband and wife was tender and passionate, years of loneliness and pain finally giving way to connection and joy. Mutawashti treated her like precious treasure, his touch reverent as he helped her understand that physical intimacy could be beautiful rather than violent. They talked through the night, making plans and sharing dreams, building the foundation of a partnership that would sustain them through the difficulties ahead. Those difficulties arrived sooner than expected. The U.S. Army increased pressure on tribes to relocate to reservations, using threats and occasional violence to enforce compliance. Mutawashti walked a razor's edge, negotiating for his people's survival while refusing to completely surrender their traditional ways. Margaret became crucial in these negotiations, her ability to speak both languages and understand both cultures making her an effective mediator. She could translate not just words but intent, helping prevent misunderstandings that might have erupted into violence. Some white settlers viewed her as a traitor, but others saw her as proof that peaceful coexistence was possible. Margaret began organizing meetings between sympathetic settlers and tribal representatives, building relationships that occasionally prevented conflicts. She wrote letters to Eastern newspapers, trying to counter the propaganda that portrayed all natives as savage and all settlers as victims. It was exhausting, often thankless work, but it mattered. Through it all, her partnership with Mutawashti deepened. They challenged each other, supported each other, and loved each other with an intensity that made the hard days bearable. When Margaret discovered she was pregnant late that first winter, the joy was tempered by fear for the kind of world their child would inherit. But Mutawashti held her and promised they would build the best future possible, one day at a time. Their daughter was born as spring returned, during a thunderstorm that Wehahquin declared auspicious. They named her Mapia Waist, Good Sky, for the way the clouds had parted just as she entered the world, letting a shaft of sunlight illuminate the lodge. Margaret held her daughter and marveled at the impossible journey that had brought her here. From a mail-order bride fleeing violence to the wife of a Lakota chief, from ignorance and prejudice to understanding and love, from helplessness to strength. Years later, when Margaret was old and her red hair had turned to silver, she would tell her grandchildren about that terrifying night she jumped from a window into an unknown future. She would describe her transformation from frightened refugee to confident leader, from Margaret to Wikapi Waist. But mostly, she would talk about the man who'd seen her value when she was broken and lost, who'd loved her not despite her differences but because of them, who'd shown her that home wasn't a place but a person. Mutawashti would sit beside her during these tellings, his own hair white with age, and add details she'd forgotten. They'd argue playfully about whose memory was more accurate, making their grandchildren laugh. Then they'd look at each other with the same intensity they'd shared across that fire so many decades before, still seeing in each other everything they'd searched for and finally found. Margaret had learned that love wasn't about perfect circumstances or easy paths. It was about choosing each other repeatedly, especially when things got hard. It was about building something new from the wreckage of what came before. It was about having the courage to jump into the unknown and trusting that sometimes, impossibly, miraculously, you'd land exactly where you belonged.